staffing this newly envisioned department with behavioral health experts, emergency dispatchers, and other necessary specialists beyond traditional first responders. This department will be a civilian-assisted response and engagement department. CARE, a care department.
Another selection there from Mayor Bruce Harrell's State of the City address as we look into the third public safety department, the CARE department, as he calls it. We're learning more details about that this week. We're also learning more about some major pieces of surveillance technology the City Council is approving for the Seattle Police Department, as well as some they are not. Plus, a sobering report on where Seattle's effort to reduce traffic injuries and deaths is falling short. Yes, these are the stories we're covering here, this and a lot more on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel here, and the views expressed here are mine. And I'm joined by my erstwhile co-host, David Croman of the Seattle Times. And David, I just wanted to let you know about a slight rules change for the podcast. I'm going to be putting a pitch clock on all of your answers, so we should be done in about 6 minutes. What do you think?
Yeah. Yeah, sounds good to me. It seems to work for baseball.
It's amazing, man. You showed that clip there of that, like, one pitch versus an entire half inning. It really is going a lot quicker, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's almost going faster than I'd like it to, but I think on balance, it's probably a good thing as far as, having people, new fans to baseball. There's, the pace was too slow before.
Indeed. We'll see where this one ends up. But David, thank you as always for joining me here. Thanks also to our patrons, too. Thanks to City Grind Espresso, our background noise sponsor for the audio podcast on the first floor of Seattle City Hall. And with those patrons, hey, the Seattle News, Views, and Brews sticker campaign is underway. Got these awesome stickers for the people who are pledging just $5 a month. We're stuck on Morty this week. He sends in a photo of his sticker stuck on the back of his car. Morty, I love it. Would be great to get more supporters supporting the show at just $5 a month. Existing patrons, I am working my way down the list. Those stickers are coming soon. Another shout out here from the Seattle Department of Transportation. This week, we've got some snow. We have some unsettled weather here, some more cold temperatures. Please keep sidewalks around your home clear of ice and slush. Be a good neighbor out there. Reduce driving if the conditions get icy out there. Stock up on groceries. Stay safe and be ready for a wild start to the month of March weather-wise here. You can learn more at seattle.gov/winter-weather. Thank you to SDOT. Thanks to Converge Media, our partner for the video version of this podcast, Wednesdays at 7. Let's get rolling with right here, right now. Well, we are finally seeing some details on how the so-called third public safety department could come together for the city of Seattle. Mayor Harrell is using the acronym CARE, Civilian Assisted Response and Engagement, and the City Council's Public Safety Committee has received an update on this project this week. Specifically, they're talking about how the city's 911 center, the Community Safety and Communication Center, the CSCC, the acronyms just keep on coming here, how they're going to handle these calls. They're seeing a report on this. They're also, we're understanding, the CSCC, they're going to be using some new software to help them develop protocols for when to send police and when to send a dual response, meaning a civilian unit too, for some of these lower acuity calls. And David, I was looking a little bit at this software. It's called Cordy. It's currently used by the Seattle Fire Department, and it's AI, artificial intelligence, that works along with the 911 call taker. AI, not getting a lot of great press these days, but reports from Seattle Fire seem to indicate this software is working well. And I think this is the real crux of the matter here, how these teams get dispatched here. What do you think about introducing this kind of technology to help send out this new dual response system?
Yeah, it's interesting. I do think that kind of at the end of the day, one of the biggest challenges around alternative responses or pulling police off of calls that they don't need to is identifying those up front. It's one thing to kind of look in retrospect at which calls did or didn't need police, but kind of making that decision in real time, I think is a real challenge. So if there is some way to kind of reduce some of that human fallibility, then great. Of course, as you mentioned, AI has shown itself to have a lot of issues too, and is certainly not infallible, but you can understand why they're looking around for ways of kind of better filtering calls. And
yeah, they get a lot of calls. They got to try to figure out how to move on them really quickly. Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I remember a couple of years ago doing a ride along with a crisis response officer, and he was showing up at a scene that clearly he didn't need to be at. It was called in as an overdose, but turned out it was related to a person's medications. You really didn't need a cop. And I
Right.
asked him if he needed to be there, and he said no, he didn't. But at the same time, the call as it came in, maybe he would have needed to be there. And so sort
Yep.
of distinguishing between those two things is certainly a challenge.
Yeah, yeah, just that whole idea of the dual response. It looks like, at least, this is something where police are going to be going with these civilian units, at least in some respects. So we'll see how that plays out. And looking at that part of it, I think that's a very important other side to this, David. In speaking about the new care department last week during the State of the City, the mayor said establishing this new response will involve bargaining with the city's current public safety unions. I see ya and hear ya, he said during his speech there. And this is a big story behind the story for me here, David. I think about the Seattle Police Officers Guild, the main union of officers that works with the city. It's under a contract right now that expired more than 2 years ago at the end of 2020. Help me out with this thought. How is this new contract with SPOG going to intersect with the new care department? Any thoughts on how that is going to work or not work? I think it's a very thorny issue.
Yeah, I don't. It's all very complicated. What is subject to bargaining and what's not. I mean,
Yeah,
if there is a change in working conditions, which I'm sure the union is arguing there is, that would be subject to bargaining. That the contract is always, anytime there's discussion around police reform or changing how policing functions in the city, the contract is always the kind of thing that no one really wants to talk about because it's
right.
the most difficult. It's not. It's done in secret, which is a tenet of labor negotiations. But at the same time, it means that the public doesn't have a great idea of what is or is not being negotiated. When it comes out, it's up or down vote. You can't, the city council can't go in and change certain things.
Weak things, right.
And so, yeah, I mean, I think the contract is the big question mark in all of this. I'm not a labor lawyer. I don't know if certain ULPs, unfair labor practices, have merit or not, or what has to be bargained. But the union, I think, as one person told me, that the union tends to outlast the elected officials in City Hall.
Right.
They have a longer memory and they are way more patient than elected officials. And so if they think that there's a fight to be had, they're gonna take that fight.
So interesting to watch that one play out. Thank you for that insight, David. And CARE, it really looked like it would first roll out this spring, but we're learning now with the council's report this week that these 911 protocols to determine when a dual response would be appropriate, they wouldn't be fully developed until later on this year. So perhaps a bit of a delay here. We're going to be watching this, but I know that the city is very intent on rolling out this program. But again, these labor issues lingering in the background are going to play a part in that too. I wanted to talk about another public safety issue, David, that's been moving under the radar. The city council this week reauthorizing a suite of surveillance technology the Seattle Police Department uses. The council put a surveillance ordinance into place in 2018. Just for background here, folks, this is so the city can be as transparent as possible about the technology it's using. Public hearings are required along with other due diligence. No huge surprises on the list of things approved. This is stuff that the SPD has been using for a while. But there was a recent piece I thought was interesting in Axios Seattle that highlighted some technology the SPD will not be using in the future, and it's called Trulio. So this is another AI system. It analyzes body camera footage, audio and video, to monitor officer behavior. And as much as that might sound like a good idea, the ACLU is saying, well, you know what, that could very easily turn into a big-time surveillance tool that people don't really need and some unwanted infringements on privacy. I just wanted to bring this up, David, because we have so many technologies that are changing so quickly, and we talk about AI. Maybe that's beneficial for 911 calls, but maybe not with the body cam footage. When these technologies change so quickly, it's tough to really tell if they're beneficial or not.
Yeah, and this sort of gets to the heart of the debate over body cameras that has really gone back to the beginning, which is, I mean, what? Because they're on the surface they seem like they're just sort of presenting what the reality before us, and therefore will be a good thing. But there is the fact that the cameras is always from the perspective of the officer because it's looking outward. But the kind of thorniest is around this question of like, when do officers have to turn it on or off? And then if it's the kind of immediate answer might be you have to keep it on all the time because then there's no discretion from the officer to switch it off when it makes them look bad. But then of course you're left with just a huge amount of footage, which is all subject to public disclosure. But sorting through that footage is really difficult. And so that's where we see these kind of AI programs being introduced. But then all of a sudden you have just authorized basically, there's 1,000 cops on the street or whatever. So 1,000 pieces of surveillance technology operating all the time with fairly advanced technology to go through that. And so then you start asking questions. Well, how is this going to be used? Is this are officers going to start using that technology to track down people with outstanding warrants? Is this really a reform tool anymore? Or is this suddenly a net benefit to police because they can scrape all this data and, go and arrest people? Sometimes incorrectly. There are examples of AI technology identifying the wrong people.
Sure.
So, this kind of tipping balance between surveillance and accountability is not new and apparent, and is just getting thornier as new technologies get introduced.
I think so too. And I mean, this Trulio technology is actually still used by many departments around the country. It's this whole idea of, let's flag the officer's behavior to make sure that they're doing the right thing. But at the same time, and I think about this especially in the state of Washington, which is a two-party consent state, which means when you're recording audio, and I know this from being a television reporter, you need to have the consent of the person doing the recording as well as the person who's being recorded here. And that can raise some thorny issues here too if people don't know they're being recorded, for example. So yeah, I'm with you. I still have a lot of questions about this technology. And like Axios, I'm asking the question if other departments out there might look at what Seattle's doing and say, because there's a lot to this. This is a very, very deep issue here. Well, let's move on here. I want to talk about a somber day of remembrance here in Seattle and a sobering reminder of the very human price of our gun violence problem. Listen up on our next segment here. Now hear this. Well, there was a very moving ceremony last week in Seattle honoring Devon Pickett Jr., a 31-year-old man shot and killed outside of his store, The Postman in the Central District. This was in October of last year. He was a giant in his community, very well loved, and his family asked to rename a portion of East Union Street between 21st and 22nd after him. Councilmember Teresa Mosqueda was a co-sponsor of the resolution to do just that, rename that street. I asked her about it on Council Edition on Seattle Channel last week, and she said the renaming is all about continuing Devon Pickett Jr.'s legacy.
To fight against inequity, to fight against gentrification, and to also make sure that we're fighting against gun violence, given that gun violence took his life. And that's, I think, the public policy call for all of us to really continue to double down on these efforts to get guns out of our streets and to make our community safer for all.
It's this last part of what she said I want to focus on here, David, this idea of a call to action to deal with gun violence in the wake of this local hero's death. We talked about gun violence numbers, you and I did a few weeks ago on the show when the SPD put out its annual report. But I look at a tragic murder like this, and I am left with that question continually. What can cities like Seattle do? Because we're certainly not alone in dealing with this. What can we do to change this trend? The community is calling out for
it. Yes, it's a good question. I mean, it's there's again, kind of talking about balance between the sense of safety and civil rights. Mayor Harrell has for years now as a city council person and now as a mayor pushed for shot spotting technology to ping whenever there's a shot fired. That every time that has come up and been introduced, which has happened several times since I've been a reporter dating back to 2015, the pushback tends to be too strong and it just doesn't get rolled out. So that seems to have happened again while Bruce Harrell is mayor. There's more enforcement, push for more cops, but then there's the kind of, violence interrupter model, which is, I think you can look at community passageways or Choose 180, in which you have folks like Dominique Davis, who himself kind of had a history of being involved with crime and now has gone on to sort of work in this role of trying to, when there is violence, sort of step in and prevent retaliations and calm things down before they escalate. How effective that is, it's, these things are hard to track because there are clear national trends that rise and fall sort of irrespective of what's happening on the local level. It's sort of with these statistics, it's always hard to tease out causation versus correlation.
So of course.
it's a conversation we've been having for a few years now, and I haven't
It
seen
is. No, and I
major
appreciate you doing it. I know it's a stumper. It's just one of these situations with Devon Pickett Jr. where he was actually one of these people involved in some of these programs to help youth in the area. He worked with the Central District Panthers football team there, the youth football team, to keep kids involved in their community there. I think about investments like that. I think about investments like the city's making in Ingram High School after the shooting there that happened last year. And I'm just trying to figure out, I think we saw some decent changes, I guess, with regard to these numbers, gun violence, et cetera, in the last quarter of last year. And overall, the 5-year trend for Seattle, those gun violence numbers are going down. But I think things spiked so much during the pandemic. We're still waiting for that to calm down and those very wide-ranging effects of the pandemic to really, I guess, settle down. I feel like that's a part of this conversation too. All these different statistics we're looking at, I feel like these 3 years or 2 years plus, I guess, of the pandemic have created some anomalies out there that are difficult to wrestle with. And I feel like gun violence might be one of them too.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, I think some of those trends we're starting to see those just outside of Seattle, which again, suggests that the pandemic has a big part in this. Services closed, after school activities closed, schools closed. So it's for my read, I do think that the pandemic played a big role in all of this. I wouldn't be able to say exactly how, but it just seems like the fact of how sharply they went up as things shut down and how they seem to be kind of coming down nationwide as things open up again. That, of course, is bigger than Seattle, but that's not to say that Seattle can't also do things to try and get in the way of gun violence.
Absolutely. No, a lot of different programs out there. Thank you for that, David. And I wanted to talk about yet another public safety issue, if you want to call it that. And I think it has some ties to the pandemic as well. The ACLU has sued King County over the conditions in its jail in downtown Seattle. In 2022, 6 people died in jail custody, 4 by suicide, a much higher rate than the pre-pandemic average for jails around our country. Coverage in the Seattle Times highlighting concerns over staffing, restrictions on visitation, even the design of the bunks in the jail has helped inform this lawsuit, which alleges King County is not providing medical care or mental health care properly. I know the county's pushing back on this one, as reported in the Times, saying it's been trying to work with the ACLU and other concerned partners on these issues. And they really thought the lawsuit was not a great way to continue that dialogue, but here we are. David, I just wanted to ask you this question. How does a lawsuit like this impact the King County Jail and, in the end, the needs of the inmates staying there? What do you think?
Well, I think it forces the conversation. I sort of was reminded of when a staff unionizes, the management always says, "Hey, this is going to interrupt this dialogue that we had," which it sounds sort of similar here, which is ACLU is kind of forcing the issue in a way that clearly is making King County uncomfortable. I think they probably have a decent argument here because there is a history, as noted by Sydney Brownstone, my colleague, there's a history of lawsuits against the King County Jail for basically just this. So the jail has certain things it sort of legally should be doing. And we know that it's understaffed. We know that inmates have been spending huge amounts of time in isolation. It was interesting.
23 plus hours in some cases. It's a lot.
Right. It's interesting how, I don't remember how long ago it was, a few months ago, maybe even a year ago at this point, the King County Public Defender's Office and the King County Correctional Officers Guild sort of issued a joint statement, which is kind of an amazing alliance because normally those two organizations would be, I would think, kind of opposed to one another, but basically saying, the conditions, there are not enough staff here and therefore the conditions are deteriorating. I've noted that since I've started, listening to some baseball games on the radio, that the King County is advertising pretty heavily for people to come and work for the corrections office. And I think they're offering up to $15,000 for lateral transfers to come and work for them because they're pretty understaffed. There's a ton of mandatory overtime, which of course means people are tired. So it's a major issue for sure. At the same time, King County, I think, is going to be hesitant to have fewer people in the jail than there already are, because a lot of people, there's a lot smaller population there than there was pre-pandemic.
Yeah, and just going back on that whole concern of different attorneys that were talking about this, it's just really interesting to see how this lack of staffing, which I think is a result of the pandemic in some ways too, because a lot of different organizations, I mean, your corner restaurant or whatever else, they can't find people to work there either. But this is a situation at the jail where when the staffing isn't there, the clients aren't getting regular changes of clothes. They've had medical appointments canceled. They missed court dates because of the lack of staffing. That extends their jail stays. So it turns into this cycle here that I think the ACLU is trying to draw attention to. And I just think about this. I hear what you're saying. I think this case does have some merits to it. And I just also am looking at the next step of this, which is this could turn into a very expensive problem for King County, which might get pushed into making a big investment in the jail when right now it's really trying to make the case to invest in mental health facilities. We're going to be seeing that in a couple months from King County. It's interesting to think about that because I think where the county wants to put its money is not in the incarceral system, but it still needs to take care of these people.
Yeah, I mean,
That's right.
Inmates have constitutional rights. It's considered cruel and unusual punishment to not provide them with basic rights.
Yeah.
The Dow Constantine had announced that the intention is to tear down this jail because it is old and it's not in good shape. It springs leaks a lot. It's cold. It's hot in the summer. But that, that's a long process. And it sort of is raising that same kind of question that we saw with the youth jail up on
right
Capitol Hill, which is, the county's making this argument that they have to rebuild it because the old one was decrepit and therefore not good for the people who are there. And so therefore it is the humane thing to rebuild this jail, while the kind of advocacy community was saying, well, as long as you're spending $250 million on a new facility, maybe it makes more sense to spend that money to keep people out of the jail to begin with. I'm sure that that's going to continue. That kind of push and pull is going to continue over the next few years as King County tries to figure out what it's doing with this building.
Yeah, no, that's a great observation. And what's happening in that downtown area with a lot of those buildings that are not used to their full potential or which have problems like the King County Jail. I think about the administration building right across the street. I mean, there's a lot of different issues right in that downtown core around those government buildings. So thank you for that. We're definitely going to be watching what happens with that over the next several weeks and months here. All right, coming up, some challenging news on Seattle's Vision Zero program, which aims for zero injuries and deaths from traffic on our city's roads. David's got the breakdown on Transportation Talk. Well, David, you had a story recently about the city's Vision Zero efforts and what it's going to take to get us there in terms of zero injuries, zero deaths out of traffic collisions. Talk to us about this recent report from the Seattle Department of Transportation and what's coming next.
Yeah, I mean, it's an acknowledgement. Well, first of all, this report has sort of been a long time coming in some ways. Greg Spotts, the new SDOT director, had promised it early in his tenure, and then at first it was going to come early January, and now here we are late February. What it isn't, it doesn't sort of single out that many specific projects. It doesn't really call for, as some advocates would want, it doesn't really call for any sort of wholesale rethinking of the transportation system. It doesn't, it's not hyper specific on arterials, which are the most dangerous streets. What it is kind of, a lot of it is sort of process, internal and kind of internally oriented. It calls for, more, reducing the friction in decision-making process, basically empowering people who think that there might be a safety problem to act on that safety problem and kind of cut down on the Seattle process.
Okay.
Calls for, elevating certain people to more positions. And, it does say that the department needs to be kind of more willing to slow speeds and possibly inconvenience drivers. So, a lot of the recommendations that we see are about process, speeding process, getting projects approved more, kind of, more money, kind of incorporating safety more fully into everyday projects. But again, I think what some people were maybe hoping for was something a little more fundamental about the transportation system, and that really is not part of this report.
I did want to make sure I made this observation, David. Is it just me, or is the city laying some groundwork for the potential renewal of the Move Seattle levy, which expires next year, the largest levy in city history when we passed it in 2015? I just wonder what this all means and what this report means in terms of the future of that measure.
Yeah, I would imagine that safety projects will be part of that, and they want to make kind of a comprehensive case for why that's important. I think that's true. It's also part of the Seattle transportation plan that is under consideration right now, which I guess is sort of a comprehensive report type thing, but for the transportation system. It should be said that Seattle is safe, has fewer deaths than other cities, on the grand scheme of things. Not as many people are killed on the roads here as in, comparably sized cities. They point to Denver and El Paso. But, I do think that it is, traffic safety has become a central topic just because it has gone up so much nationwide, both in Washington state. And so it's getting a renewed focus. And then it kind of, that safety conversation also dovetails with sort of larger conversations around the sort of transportation system that we want and who it serves. So, I think you're right. I think in some ways this does kind of set the tone for a rollout of probably a new tax measure for transportation.
Right. And can we touch on one last issue with this, David? This whole balance between we need to actually reshape our streets, meaning reduce the lanes, et cetera, have some more bike lanes, things of this nature, slow people down through the actual physical construction of the street. That's one piece of it. And then there's an enforcement piece too, this idea of, okay, maybe we control the amount of right turns on red lights. Maybe we have some more cameras set up. I think the city's trying a both and approach here. And I just wanted to make sure you touched on that part, because I think that's part of the conversation too.
Yeah, it is. The right turns on red. I mean, some of these are conversations that are being mirrored in the state level. The state actually just yesterday passed an incentive off the House floor for Washington state troopers to increase enforcement because, ticket writing is still way down. And, there's talk about expanding automated enforcement and traffic cameras in the city. And as you mentioned, banning certain rights on red in certain locations. I think that is sort of probably a more kind of near-term way that lawmakers are looking at reducing traffic deaths. And, that might have a significant effect. Others would argue that you can't sort of police a system that is inherently unsafe. You can't police away those traffic deaths. And so, there's always a balance between that kind of system, treating the symptoms versus treating the cause.
Right. Thank you for all these, David. I'm very interested to see what happens with this and what Director Spots is going to do with this information over the next year here. But it is time to wrap up. And David is probably going to be taking a break here and there over the next couple of weeks. And I just wanted to make sure I let people know it's all on the up and up. It's for some family time. But let me just ask the question. You're sure you're not just going on a long road trip down to Arizona
I know.
for spring training? I just wanted to make sure I verified on.
We did kind of weigh whether we should take a trip south to get a little sunshine, but no, this is to hang out with my 4.5-month-old.
Awesome. You got to do it. And if I got to say, at that age, they are absolutely enthralled with baseball games. I know my little ones were, and that was a great way to put them to sleep at the very least. So I don't know what the pitch clock is going to do with that, though. So we'll have to see how that pans out. Well, thank you, David, as always, for helping me out here and being on the show. Thanks to everyone listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. This podcast is on Apple, Spotify, whatever platform you like to listen on. We got you covered here. Also, please find Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon and show your support there. Thanks for watching on Converge Media 2 every Wednesday night. We'll see you next time.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2023.